Hi everyone. It's been a couple weeks since I've actually spoken in a video. The reason is that I like Linda Hogan's work to speak for itself. I like for you to hear her speak about her writing. She's an interesting writer, and it's good to hear her perspective. Um, my perspective would be a projection of my analysis, and I want you to make your own inferences and analyze it on your own. Normally, I would have a big class discussion and have everybody talk about it and talk about their ideas about the literature and contribute a little bit. But our discussion is mostly through writing, which works just as well. But I wanted to make sure to talk about the carrier bag theory of fiction by Ursula Le Guin and why I included it in the class. Some of you submitted your formal writing assignments, and they were awesome, and you clearly understood. If you're feeling lost even after this video, you should go to YouTube, and you can find many videos of people analyzing Ursula Le Guin's concept and also the evolutionary concept of the carrier bag theory of evolution. So here, this little quote that they added here, it is the story that makes the difference, not the hero's journey. I think they mean that in contrast to the hero's journey. The hero's journey is a popular way of looking at mythology, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the way we look at modern literature. The idea is that we don't have to look at it as in that linear progression of a hero embarks, they go on an adventure that has a rising action, a conflict, a rising action, a climax, a falling action, and a resolution. That doesn't have to be the way that we look at literature. And she's trying to argue that you can look at it as if it's a container that stores information in it and shares that information. And it stores lessons and shares those lessons with others. And that way, if you look at it that way, sometimes you might feel disappointed if you watch a movie that doesn't have a lot of action. I know there's a movie called Effie Gray about a woman who is painted by Millet and he ends up marrying her, but she was married to this art critic who they got divorced. It was a big deal at the time. And the movie's very slow, and there's not a lot of action. Nothing really happens, it seems. If you're not paying attention, you're not going to learn anything. Or there's a new movie called The Widow Clicquot, and there's not a lot of action in that movie either. Or you might look at like Jane Austen books and just think, oh my God, these are so boring. But actually in those novels or those stories, the lessons are given to you to think about. It's not necessarily something that's supposed to have a perfect ending. People get really disappointed by like the White Lotus ending and stuff. And endings are so important. That linear progression, you want it to match what you think it should be, and so like season 3 was a little too predictable, but the other seasons seemed far-fetched in the end. But that's because we're all looking for that linear progression of stories that we heard since we were children. And she's trying to argue that here about how we're always looking at history, especially through when men are the only historians and men are the only archaeologists and men are the only anthropologists. There isn't this perspective that a woman can provide that might look at the role of women in a less submissive way, or the role of women's tools, or even just tools that we say are women's tools, but actually were everybody's tools. So we might see the sword, the knife, or the arrowhead as a male tool, and the bowl and the basket as a women's tool. But it turns out actually that the tools that women were using were actually the first tools that anyone made. And all the male and female ancestors were using baskets before they used tools, before they used weapons. And she's trying to say she's going to take that concept of the carrier bag theory of evolution and put it into literature. So in her literature, she's arguing that she brings a basket full of these things that she's learned in her life and that other people have taught her, and she puts it into her novels. And so you might be disappointed when you read her novels because they're not like other science fiction that, like Star Wars, where it has a clear hero's journey. It maps the perfect Jungian Joseph Campbell hero's journey, the hero of A Thousand Faces. He meets it's a innocent boy who goes off on an adventure. He confronts his shadow. He realizes the truth, and then he's enlightened in the end. And these mapped the myth stories of war, and then all war literature basically after that. And Don Quixote, which was kind of the first novel, also had that. And some people argue that a novel isn't a novel unless it has that action and that linear, that kind of rise and fall. But she's trying to say that actually a lot of literature, if you go back to some books that you maybe thought were boring because they didn't have that action, and think about them as a basket that is teaching you lessons, you will come out of it appreciating that literature a little bit more than you did previously. I also, okay, here. She says, science fiction properly conceived, like all serious fiction, however funny, is a way of trying to describe what is in fact going on, what people actually do and feel, how people relate to everything else in this vast sack, this belly of the universe, this womb of things to be and tomb of things that were, this unending story. In it, as in all fiction, there is room enough to keep even man where he belongs, in his place in the scheme of things. There is time enough to gather plenty of wild oats and sow them too, and to sing to little and listen to Ool's joke and watch newts, and still the story isn't over. Still there are seeds to be gathered and room in the bag of stars. I think about this in relation to Linda Hogan's work, which is very much so not science fiction. It's very much so the opposite. She says, my work isn't even a metaphor. Even the part with the octopus isn't a metaphor. It's a real thing that she must have heard happened with an octopus. She doesn't want us to think of the whale as a metaphor like in Moby Dick. She doesn't want, which is a novel by Herman Melville. And she doesn't want us to think of the octopus as a metaphor that symbolizes things in the future of the story. She wants us to see it that octopus was real. It really does do that. That the whales really do what they're doing. The humans really do what they're doing, and it is all real. So it's not science fiction. However, it also does this same exact thing. And the novel starts with a man going to war and thinking he and his friends are going to be improved by being so patriotic for a country that has not treated them well. But they still feel patriotic. They feel like Americans, and then realize, no, there are a lot of Americans who don't see them as American and treat them badly. And he ends up abandoning the war. He ends up killing Americans and living with a family in Vietnam as if he's Vietnamese, and then until he's found out. So that's kind of the hero's journey. And then it's abruptly shortened. The hero's journey is very short. It comes back through memory. And really what you have is a man who's very sad. And he's no longer the main character of the story. You realize that the woman is the main character of the story. His wife, well, his first wife, is the main character of the story. And her conflict is Marco, essentially her son, dying. But also just life is her conflict. There's no specific conflict that propels the story forward. There's her trying to live her life and her trying to help other people live their lives. Her generosity, her boat, essentially, for me, is that basket. And she brings people into it. She's very forgiving. She helps people live. She helps everybody in the story find peace within themselves. Not everybody in the story, but a lot of the characters find peace within themselves because of her. And she reveals what is really happening right now. I think that this part is her character, um, and her power in the story. I'm being a little vague because I want you to I want you to be the one that reads it and that comes to this conclusion yourself. Like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm giving you kind of an idea of what I meant by this is a carrier bag novel. This isn't a hero's journey novel. And if you think of it as a hero's journey novel, you might be pretty disappointed in it. But if you think of it as a carrier basket, you'll learn so much from it. Um, and in a way, there's room to learn by doing repetitive actions like sowing seeds. Like she's saying at the beginning here that it's boring. The story isn't there in people sowing seeds and putting seeds into their basket or putting fruit into their basket to save for winter. Except that my children's favorite book is Blueberries for Sal, which is basically that. But she's saying that that's not the story that people are interested in. And yet in People of the Whale, you realize how interesting that is. Learning about the life of somebody else, getting rid of your own projections, your own feelings about the world, and putting them aside, and focusing on how somebody else views the world, and then trying to place that back into your own life and use how they act in order to influence perhaps positively how you were going to act, rather than just saying, I want to focus on literature that has action and is plot driven. You're focusing on what is the life that I'm learning today through this novel. And I also hope that you'll check out Ursula K. Le Guin's work, because she's amazing. She's actually my father's favorite author, so it's pretty cool. All right. Thank you.